The last golden rays of sunset stretched across the dusty main street of Dust Vale, painting the weathered wooden buildings in shades of orange and regret. Clara Hartwell stood in the doorway of her father's café, wiping flour-streaked hands on her faded blue apron as she watched the last customer of the day disappear into the saloon across the street. The warm smell of freshly baked bread drifted out into the cooling evening air, but it didn't bring her the comfort it once had. These days, the comforting sense of yeast and cinnamon only reminded her how much she was struggling to keep her father's dream alive. Inside the small kitchen, Clara counted the day's earnings again, her calloused fingers smoothing the few coins on the worn countertop. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. The bank notice tucked beneath the flour bin seemed to burn through the wood, its cruel words about unpaid debts and foreclosure dates flashing in her mind no matter how hard she tried to forget them. A sudden crash from the alleyway made her jump. Clara's hand instinctively reached for the heavy rolling pin she kept by the door. The town had been restless lately, ever since Silas Grant started buying up properties, turning honest folks out of their homes and businesses. She peered through the grimy window, her breath fogging the glass as she tried to make out shapes in the growing darkness. What she saw wasn't one of Silas's hired men, but something far more pitiful. A tall, lean figure slumped against her trash bins, his too thin frame barely visible in the shadows. As Clara watched, the stranger reached a trembling hand toward the half-eaten biscuit that had fallen from her waste bucket earlier. Something twisted in Clara's chest. She knew hunger when she saw it, had seen it in the mirror too many mornings herself these past months. Before she could think better of it, she grabbed the last remaining steak pie from the cooling rack and pushed open the back door. The man startled like a wild animal, his dark eyes wide with a mix of shame and defiance as they locked onto hers. Up close, she could see he was younger than she first thought, maybe mid-20s, with sun-browned skin and hair that hadn't been cut in months. His clothes hung loose on his frame, the elbows of his jacket worn through, cuffs frayed. "That's trash," Clara said, nodding to the discarded biscuit in his hand. Her voice came out harsher than she meant it to. "Ain't fit for dogs, let alone people." The stranger's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't drop the food. "Been called worse than a dog," he muttered, his voice rough like he hadn't used it in days. Clara hesitated, then thrust the still warm pie toward him. "Here, fresh today." For a long moment, the man just stared at the offering, his expression caught between suspicion and desperate hope. When he finally reached out, his fingers brushed against hers, warm, rough, and trembling slightly. The simple contact sent an unexpected jolt through Clara, like touching a live wire. As he tore into the food with barely restrained hunger, Clara studied him. Beneath the dirt and weariness, there was something decent in his face. The straight line of his nose, the stubborn set of his jaw. But his eyes told a different story, shadowed and cautious, the eyes of someone who'd seen too much and trusted too little. "You got a name?" she asked. He swallowed hard, wiping crumbs from his mouth with the back of his hand. "Jesse Boone." The name came out quiet, like he wasn't sure he should be giving it. Clara crossed her arms. "You looking for work, Jesse Boone?" His head snapped up, suspicion flashing across his face. "Why? You offering?" "I might be," Clara said slowly, already questioning her own sanity. "I can't pay much, but there's a cot in the storeroom and meals if you're willing to work." Jesse's gaze darted past her to the café, then back to her face, searching for the catch. "What's the work?" "Chopping wood, hauling supplies, fixing what's broken." Clara shrugged. "Whatever needs doing." For the first time, something like life came into Jesse's tired eyes. "Why me?" Clara thought about the bank notice hidden in her kitchen, about Silas Grant's smug face when he'd offered to help her out last week, about how heavy the flour sacks had felt this morning when she'd strained to lift them alone. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," she said finally, "even if they don't know they need one yet." The words hung between them in the gathering twilight. Somewhere down the street, a door slammed, making them both jump. The moment stretched, fragile as spun sugar. Then Jesse nodded, just once. Clara turned back toward the café, not waiting to see if he followed. Either he would or he wouldn't. That was the thing about second chances. You had to be willing to take them when they came. The wooden steps creaked behind her as Jesse followed her inside. The door clicked shut, sealing them both in the warm, flower-dusted sanctuary of the kitchen. Outside, the first stars began to appear over Dust Vale, their faint light barely piercing the darkness. But inside Hartwell's cafe, for the first time in months, something kindled to life. Something that might, just might, be hope. The first light of dawn had barely touched the horizon when Clara awoke to the sound of chopping wood. She blinked sleep from her eyes, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped into the chilly morning air. There, in the pale gray light, stood Jesse Boone, his breath puffing white in the cold as he split logs with steady, practiced swings. Clara watched silently from the doorway. He worked with a quiet determination, his movements efficient despite the early hour. The pile of firewood beside him was already impressive. She hadn't expected him to start before sunrise. "You're up early," she said finally. Jesse startled slightly, then wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Figured I'd earn my keep." His voice was still rough with sleep, but there was something different in it today. Less guarded, maybe. Clara nodded toward the woodpile. "That'll last me a week." "Good." He set another log on the stump. "Then maybe I'll stay longer than that." The words hung between them, simple but weighted. Clara didn't answer. Instead, she turned back toward the kitchen. "Come inside when you're done. Breakfast won't cook itself." By mid-morning, the cafe was alive with the usual bustle of regulars, ranchers stopping in for coffee before heading out to their herds, shopkeepers grabbing a quick bite before opening their stores. Clara moved between tables with practiced ease, refilling cups and clearing plates, all while keeping one eye on Jesse. He had taken to washing dishes without being asked, his large hands surprisingly careful with the delicate china. Every now and then, he glanced up, watching the customers with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. "Who's the new help?" Mrs. Wilkins asked as Clara set down her usual order of toast and jam. Clara didn't look up, just passing through. Mrs. Wilkins hummed, her sharp eyes studying Jesse. "Looks like he's seen hard times." Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Everyone in Dust Vale had seen hard times. That evening, as Clara kneaded dough for the next day's bread, Jesse appeared in the kitchen doorway, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. "Need help?" Clara hesitated, then nodded toward the sack of flour in the corner. "You can measure out the next batch." Jesse moved to obey, his hands surprisingly steady as he scooped flour into the bowl. But then he paused, frowning. "Something wrong?" Clara asked. He shook his head. "Just, you ever try adding a pinch of sugar to the dough?" Clara blinked. "Why?" "Makes it rise better," he said simply. "My ma used to do it." Clara stared at him. No one had touched her father's recipes since he died. But then she remembered the bank notice, the dwindling customers. Maybe it was time for a change. "Fine," she said, "but if it ruins the bread, you're eating every last loaf." A ghost of a smile touched Jesse's lips. "Deal." As they worked side by side, the kitchen filled with the warm, yeasty scent of rising dough. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, for the first time in a long time, cafe felt alive. The bread was a hit. Clara couldn't deny it. The loaves were lighter, with a golden crust that crackled when broken apart. Even old Mr. Henderson, who had complained about every change Clara had ever made, grunted in approval as he chewed. "You finally got your pa's recipe right," he said around a mouthful. Clara didn't correct him. Over the next few days, Jesse settled into the rhythm of the cafe. He chopped wood, hauled supplies, and even started greeting customers with a quiet nod. But Clara noticed the way his eyes still darted to the door whenever someone new entered, the way his shoulders tensed at the sound of horses outside. She didn't ask. Everyone had their ghosts. Then, one night, Clara awoke to the sound of clattering pans. She grabbed her shawl and hurried downstairs, her heart pounding. The kitchen was empty, except for Jesse, standing over the stove with a spoon in hand. "What are you doing?" Jesse jumped, nearly dropping the spoon. In the dim lantern light, Clara could see a pot simmering on the stove, its contents giving off a rich, savory scent. "Couldn't sleep," he muttered. Clara stepped closer, peering into the pot. It was her father's steak pie filling, but different. The usual recipe was simple: beef, potatoes, a bit of salt and pepper. But this smelled deeper, richer. "What did you do?" Jesse hesitated. "Added some things. Thyme, a bit of whiskey. It was just sitting there, and I thought." Clara's first instinct was to snap at him. How dare he touch her father's recipes? But the smell, it was intoxicating. Without a word, she grabbed a spoon and tasted it. The flavors exploded on her tongue, warm, complex, perfect. It was her father's pie, but better. She looked up at Jesse, who was watching her with wary eyes, braced for anger. Clara set the spoon down. "We'll need to make more." Jesse blinked. "What? If we're serving this tomorrow, we'll need more," she said, already reaching for the flour. A slow smile spread across Jesse's face, the first real one she'd seen from him. Together, in the quiet of the night, they worked, the kitchen filled with the promise of something new. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, silent witnesses to the small, fragile trust growing between them. But in the shadows beyond the cafe's warm light, a figure watched, and not all of them had kind intentions. The morning sun had barely risen when Clara heard the first crash. She rushed outside, flour still dusting her apron, to find Jesse standing amidst scattered sacks of grain. The storage shed door hung crooked on its hinges, its lock broken. Overturned barrels littered the ground, their precious contents spilled across the dirt. Jesse met her eyes, his expression grim. Was an animal's. Clara knelt, running her fingers through the ruined flour. The perfect white powder was now gray with dirt. Her chest tightened. This was a week's worth of supplies gone. A glint of metal caught her eye. She picked up a brass button, its polished surface gleaming against her flour-streaked palm. The same buttons Silas Grant's men wore on their coats. Jesse took the button from her, his jaw tightening. "They're trying to scare you." Clara stood abruptly, brushing flour from her skirts. "Then they don't know me very well." By noon, word had spread through Dust Vale. The church ladies arrived first, their baskets filled with spare eggs and preserves. Then came the ranchers, offering cuts of meat from their own dwindling stocks. Even old Mr. Henderson shuffled in with a sack of potatoes from his root cellar. Clara stood frozen in her cafe doorway, her throat tight as the townspeople filed past her with their offerings. Jesse moved quietly beside her, accepting each gift with quiet thanks. Mrs. Wilkins pressed a jar of honey into Clara's hands. "We look after our own," she said firmly. Clara could only nod, the words sticking in her throat. That evening, as they worked side by side preparing the next day's meals, Jesse broke the comfortable silence. "Why do they hate you so much?" Clara didn't look up from kneading dough. "Silas wants this land. The railroad's coming through next year." She punched the dough harder than necessary. "My father refused to sell. Now I'm refusing." Jesse's hand stilled on the potatoes he was peeling. "That takes grit." Clara snorted. "Or stubbornness." For the first time since the vandalism, Jesse smiled. "Either way, I respect it." Their eyes met across the flour-dusted table. Something warm and unfamiliar fluttered in Clara's chest. She looked away first. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of laughter from Silas's saloon. But inside Hartwell's cafe, surrounded by the gifts of her neighbors, Clara felt something she hadn't in years: hope. Rain pattered against the cafe windows as Clara showed Jesse how to knead bread dough properly. His large hands, more accustomed to handling reins and ropes, fumbled with the delicate task. "Like this," Clara said, demonstrating the motion. "Push, fold, turn. It's about patience, not strength." Jesse tried again, his brow furrowed in concentration. His first attempt toward the dough. Clara surprised herself by laughing. "You're treating it like an enemy." Jesse's shoulders relaxed slightly. never been much for gentle things. Without thinking, Clara reached out, covering his flour-dusted hands with her own, guiding them through the motions. His skin was warm beneath hers, rough with calluses, yet surprisingly gentle under her direction. The moment stretched. Clara became acutely aware of how close they stood, of the way Jesse's breath hitched when her fingers brushed his wrist. She stepped back abruptly, wiping her hands on her apron. "You'll get it," she said, her voice coming out oddly breathless. Jesse studied her for a long moment before returning to the dough. This time, his movements were smoother, more controlled. Silence settled between them, comfortable, yet charged with something unspoken. The only sounds were the rain against the windows and the soft thump of dough against wood. Then Jesse spoke, his voice so quiet Clara almost missed it. "I didn't steal that money." Clara stilled. This was the first time he'd volunteered anything about his past. Jesse kept his eyes on the dough. "Was working for a ranch up north. Boss accused me of taking wages from a strongbox." His hands clenched slightly. "Had my name on a wanted poster before I could prove otherwise." Clara's chest ached. She thought of the way Jesse flinched at sudden noises, how he always positioned himself, facing the door. "Is that why you're always watching?" Jesse nodded. "Bounty hunters don't much care about the truth." The dough between them was perfectly kneaded now, smooth and elastic. Clara reached out, not for the bread, but to place her hand over Jesse's. His fingers trembled slightly beneath hers. "I believe you," she said simply. Something in Jesse's expression softened, like a weight had been lifted. Outside, the rain slowed to a gentle patter. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, but the storm, at least between them, had passed. That night, as Clara lay in bed, she realized something surprising. She trusted Jesse Boone. More than that, she wanted him to stay. The thought should have scared her, but as sleep pulled her under, all she felt was a quiet, unfamiliar warmth, like the first rays of sun after a long winter. Clara was wiping down tables after the lunch rush when the stranger walked in. The moment the door creaked open, she felt a change in the air. The usual chatter of customers died away. Even the clatter of forks against plates stilled. Clara looked up to see a man in a dust-colored duster standing just inside the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for prey. Her gaze flicked instinctively to the kitchen, where Jesse was washing dishes. Through the serving window, she saw his hands freeze in the soapy water. The stranger tipped his hat at Clara. "Ma'am." His voice was polite, but edged with steel. "Heard this was the best place in town for a meal." Clara forced herself to breathe normally as she approached him. "We serve good food," she agreed, keeping her voice steady. "Would you like a table?" The man took her veil. His name came to her suddenly from Jesse's story. Smiled without warmth. "Much obliged." As she led him to a corner table, Clara noticed how his eyes kept drifting toward the kitchen, how his right hand never strayed far from his hip. In the kitchen, Jesse had disappeared. Clara moved mechanically through taking the bounty hunter's order, her mind racing. She delivered a steak pie with hands that only shook slightly, then hurried back to the kitchen. Jesse was crouched in the pantry, his face pale. "He's here for me." Clara pressed a finger to her lips, listening for footsteps. "Does he know you're here?" Jesse shook his head. "Not yet, but he won't stop looking." The sound of a chair scraping came from the dining room. Clara peeked through the door. Tucker was standing, his meal half eaten, his gaze fixed on the kitchen door. Without thinking, Clara grabbed Jesse's arm and pulled him toward the root cellar. "Stay here. Don't make a sound." Jesse caught her wrist. "Clara, if he finds me." "He won't." She squeezed his hand once before closing the cellar door behind her just as the kitchen door swung open. Tucker Vale stood there, his expression unreadable. "Fine pie, ma'am." His eyes swept the kitchen. "You work here alone?" Clara lifted her chin. "I have help." The bounty hunter nodded slowly. "Big fellow, dark hair?" "Saw him through the window earlier." Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. "He's not here now." Tucker studied her for a long moment, then reached into his coat. Clara tensed. but he only pulled out a wanted poster. The sketch showed a younger Jesse, but the eyes were unmistakable. Jesse Boone, Tucker said. Wanted for theft in Laramie County. You seen him? Clara's mouth went dry. The truth balanced on her tongue, ready to spill out. Then she remembered Jesse's hands guiding hers as they kneaded dough. The way he'd stood between her and Silas's men when they'd come calling. She swallowed hard. No, never heard of him. Tucker's eyes narrowed. He knew she was lying. Just then, the church bells began to ring. Signal for a town meeting. Tucker hesitated, then tipped his hat again. I'll be around, ma'am, if you remember anything. As he left, Clara sagged against the counter, her legs suddenly weak. She had just lied to a bounty hunter. For Jesse. When she opened the cellar door, Jesse was waiting, his expression torn between gratitude and guilt. You shouldn't have done that. Clara crossed her arms. Well, I did. Their eyes met in the dim kitchen light. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a promise. Outside, the church bells continued to ring, but in that moment, the only sound Clara heard was the pounding of her own heart. The morning of the harvest festival dawned bright and clear, until Clara opened the oven. A cloud of smoke billowed out, stinging her eyes. She grabbed a towel, waving it frantically as she pulled out the tray of biscuits. Or what should have been biscuits. The charred lumps looked more like coal than food. Jesse appeared at her side, coughing. What happened? Clara gestured helplessly at the stove. It won't hold heat anymore. Everything's burning or staying raw. Jesse knelt beside the ancient cast-iron stove, running his hands along its side. Fireboxes cracked. He looked up at Clara, his expression grim. We can't cook for the festival on this. Clara's heart sank. The harvest festival was their chance to prove to the town, and to Silas, that Hartwell's café was still the heart of Dust Vale. Without it, a knock at the back door startled them both. Preacher Matthews stood there, his kind eyes taking in the scene. Trouble. Clara bit her lip. Stove's broken. We can't. The preacher held up a hand. Let me see. To their astonishment, he rolled up his sleeves and joined Jesse by the stove. As they worked, Clara learned that the preacher had been a blacksmith's apprentice in his youth. Between the two men, they managed a temporary fix, but the oven still wouldn't hold a steady temperature. Jesse wiped grease from his hands. We'll have to improvise. Clara looked at the ruined biscuits, then at the meager ingredients they had left after Silas's sabotage. With what? A slow smile spread across Jesse's face, the one that many had an idea Clara might not like. Trust me, against all logic, she realized she did. By noon, the town square was packed. Long tables groaned under dishes from every family in Dust Vale, except, conspicuously, Hartwell's café. Then Jesse appeared, carrying a massive cast-iron pot. Clara followed with bowls of chopped vegetables and meat. As curious townspeople gathered around, Jesse built a small fire in the square's central pit. He set the pot over it and began layering ingredients. Tough cuts of meat, withered carrots, potatoes starting to sprout. Everything that should have been useless. What is that? Mrs. Wilkins asked, wrinkling her nose. Jesse stirred the pot with a long wooden spoon. Outlaw stew. You take what you've got and make it work. Clara added the last of her precious spices, the rich aroma rising with the steam. As the strange concoction simmered, something magical happened. The tough meat softened. The sad vegetables swelled with flavor. The entire square filled with a smell that made stomachs growl. When the first brave soul tasted it, their eyes widened. This is amazing. Soon, the entire town was lining up for bowls. Even Silas's men couldn't resist, though they took their portions scowling. As Clara watched Jesse ladle stew for the townspeople, she realized something. This wasn't just about food. It was about resilience, about community, about taking broken things and making them whole again. Preacher Matthews appeared at her shoulder, watching the scene with a knowing smile. The good book says man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. He nodded toward the pot. Seems your young man knows that truth too. Clara's face warmed at the words, "You're a young man." But she didn't correct him, because looking at Jesse now, his sleeves rolled up, his face smudged with soot but alight with quiet pride, she realized how far they'd both come. The stove might be broken, the biscuits might be burnt, but somehow, impossibly, everything else was starting to feel right. The festival fire crackled low as the last scraps of daylight faded over Dust Vale. Clara watched from behind the serving table as Jesse ladled another helping of stew into Mrs. Wilkins' bowl. The elderly woman sniffed skeptically before taking a bite. Then her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Well, I'll be," she muttered. "This is actually good." A ripple of laughter passed through the gathered townspeople. One by one, even the most doubtful among them tried the strange stew, their expressions shifting from suspicion to delight. Clara's chest swelled as she watched Silas Grant's men shuffle awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, their untouched plates growing cold while the rest of the town devoured Jesse's creation. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" young Tommy Larson asked through a mouthful of potatoes. Jesse's stirring slowed. "When you spend enough nights under the stars, you learn to make do." His eyes met Clara's across the fire. "Or you go hungry." The simple truth of it struck Clara like a physical blow. How many nights had Jesse gone to bed hungry? How many meals had he scavenged just to survive? And yet here he stood, feeding an entire town with nothing but scraps and ingenuity. As if sensing her thoughts, Jesse came to stand beside her, their shoulders brushing lightly. "We did all right," he murmured. Clara studied the happy crowd, the empty pot, the way even the preacher was licking his spoon clean. "Better than all right," she admitted. Then she saw it. Silas Grant himself pushing through the crowd, his expensive boots kicking up dust. The chatter died as he approached the serving table, his cold eyes fixed on Jesse. "Interesting dish," Silas drawled, poking at the last bits in the pot. "Though I suppose when you're used to eating trash, anything tastes fine." The insult hung in the air like gun smoke. Clara felt Jesse tense beside her, but before either could respond, Preacher Matthews stepped forward. "Funny thing about cooking," the preacher said calmly. "The humblest ingredients often make the richest meals." He fixed Silas with a knowing look. "Unlike some fancy dishes that are all show and no substance." A few townspeople chuckled. Silas's face darkened. He leaned close to Jesse, his voice low but carrying. "Enjoy your victory, Boone. It won't last." As Silas stalked away, Clara instinctively reached for Jesse's hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong despite their trembling. The contact sent a jolt through her. When had she started seeking comfort from his touch? When had his presence become as familiar as her father's old recipes? The fire popped, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. Around them, the festival continued, laughter and music pushing back the darkness. But Clara couldn't shake the chill Silas's words had left behind. Jesse squeezed her hand once before letting go. "We should get back," he said quietly. "Big day tomorrow." Clara nodded, but as they walked away from the festival, she couldn't help glancing over her shoulder. Silas stood watching them from the shadows, his expression unreadable. The message was clear. This wasn't over. Clara knew something was wrong the moment she stepped outside. The crisp morning air carried an acrid tang, smoke. Not the comforting kind from a cook fire, but the sharp, choking scent of something burning that shouldn't be. "Jesse," she called, running toward the source of the smell. Behind the café, tendrils of gray curled from the storage shed. Jesse was already there, beating at the flames with a sack. Clara grabbed another and joined him, her eyes watering from the smoke. By the time they put out the fire, the damage was done. Half their remaining supplies were ruined, including the precious sourdough starter Clara's mother had given her father on their wedding day. The crock lay shattered, decades of tradition spilled across the dirt like so much wasted flour. Clara sank to her knees, her fingers hovering over the mess. "Silas," she whispered. Jesse's hand on her shoulder was the only thing keeping her from crumbling. "We don't know that." But they did. The broken lock, the familiar brass button glinting in the ashes. The message was clear. This was just the beginning. The sheriff refused to help. "Can't prove it was Silas's men," he said, not meeting Clara's eyes. "Besides, could have been an accident." Jesse's hands clenched at his sides. "And the missing cattle?" The sheriff's gaze flickered. "What missing cattle?" That afternoon, news spread through Dust Vale. Silas was accusing Jesse of stealing his prize bulls. A bounty notice appeared on the saloon door, offering 10 times the usual reward for Jesse Boone's capture. Clara found Jesse in the kitchen, packing supplies with hurried hands. "You're leaving," she said flatly. Jesse paused, his back still to her. "It's better this way." "Is it?" Clara's voice broke. "Running won't prove your innocence." Jesse turned then, his face anguished. "Staying will get me hanged." The raw fear in his voice struck Clara like a physical blow. For the first time, she truly saw the terror beneath Jesse's brave front. The years of being hunted, of never knowing who to trust. She stepped forward, taking his face in her flour-dusted hands. "Then we prove you're innocent." Jesse's breath hitched. "Clara!" A commotion outside cut him off. Shouts, the sound of approaching horses. Tucker Vale's voice carried through the walls. "Jesse Boone, come out with your hands up." Clara's grip tightened. "The cellar." Jesse shook his head, gently removing her hands. No more hiding. Before she could stop him, he was out the door, hands raised as he faced the bounty hunter and half a dozen of Silas's men. Silas himself stepped forward, smirking. "Knew you were trouble the moment you rode into town." Jesse stood tall, his voice clear. "I didn't take your cattle." "Then where were you last night?" Silas challenged. Clara pushed through the gathered crowd. "He was with me. All night." The lie burned her cheeks, but she held Silas's gaze defiantly. Tucker Vale studied them both, his expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's shock, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a set of branding irons. "Found these hidden in Grant's barn," the bounty hunter said, along with fresh hides bearing the Lazy J brand. He fixed Silas with a hard look. "Seems someone's been rustling their own cattle to blame others." The crowd erupted. Silas's face purpled with rage. "You're lying." Tucker merely shrugged. "Check for yourself." As the townspeople turned on Silas, Clara rushed to Jesse's side. His hands were shaking as he lowered them, his eyes never leaving Tucker's face. "Why?" Jesse asked hoarsely. The bounty hunter tipped his hat. "Truth matters, even to men like me." Then he was gone, melting into the dispersing crowd as quickly as he'd appeared. Clara turned to Jesse, her heart pounding. "It's over." But the look in Jesse's eyes told her the same thing the sinking sun did. Some storms aren't so easily weathered. Some battles leave scars that never fully heal. And some truths, once spoken, change everything. The morning of the grand reopening dawned bright and golden, the kind of day that made Clara believe in fresh starts. She stood outside Hartwell's café, staring up at the new sign swinging gently in the breeze. "Hartwell and Boone, second helpings welcome." Jesse came up beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "Looks good," he murmured. Clara smiled. "Better than good." Inside, the café buzzed with activity. The repaired stove glowed warmly, filling the kitchen with the rich scent of baking bread. Townspeople crowded around the tables, their chatter mixing with the clink of dishes. Even Mrs. Wilkins had brought her famous apple cake to celebrate. Clara watched Jesse move through the crowd, his once guarded expression now open and easy. He laughed at something Tommy Larson said, then crouched to show the boy how to roll biscuit dough properly. The sight made something warm and bright settle in Clara's chest. Preacher Matthews sidled up to her, a cup of coffee in hand. "Quite the transformation," he said, nodding toward Jesse. Clara sighed contentedly. Turns out all he needed was a second chance. The preacher chuckled, and maybe someone to believe in him. Their eyes met, and Clara felt her cheeks heat. She busied herself with straightening her apron. As the afternoon wore on, Jesse disappeared into the kitchen. Clara was about to follow when he reappeared, carrying a steaming steak pie, but not the usual kind. This one smelled different, richer somehow. Jesse set it carefully in front of her. Try it. Clara took a bite and froze. The flavors exploded on her tongue. The perfect blend of spices, the tender meat, the flaky crust. But there was something else, something familiar she couldn't quite place. Your father's recipe, Jesse said softly. With the rosemary he always added. You mentioned it once. Clara's vision blurred. She hadn't tasted that particular herb blend since before her father died. How did you? Jesse shrugged, but his eyes were bright. Listen when you talked about him. Figure it was time to bring him back into this kitchen too. The lump in Clara's throat made it impossible to speak. Instead, she reached for Jesse's hand, threading her fingers through his. His palm was warm and rough against hers, solid and real and exactly where he was meant to be. Around them, café hummed with life. The clatter of forks, the rise and fall of voices, the sweet notes of the church piano drifting through the open windows. Outside, the sun painted everything in gold. Jesse squeezed her hand. What now? Clara looked around at their café, their town, their future. She smiled. Now we eat. And as they sat down together at the head table, surrounded by friends and the comforting smells of home, Clara realized something wonderful. Sometimes the best recipes are the ones you never planned. Did you enjoy Clara and Jesse's story? If this tale of second chances and frontier cooking warmed your heart, be sure to like and subscribe for more wholesome historical romances. Let us know in the comments, what's your favorite comfort food that tastes like home? Want more heartwarming tales? Click the bell icon so you never miss a new story.